And we are live. So, welcome everyone again. This time on for our third session of HR Unscripted, we've got Dr. Dieter Veldsman. He's a true heavyweight in the HR industry. So, he won the CHRO of the Year award in 2021. He's a Practitioner of the Year in 2018. He has several years of experience in EMEA, APAC, LATAM, pretty valuable global experience. He dabbles in AI as well, but he has a lot of wealth of knowledge within HR itself. And as we were talking about the session today, it was very clear and evident that he had a lot of experience within organizational design and how he sees it as an essential tool for most companies to leverage and really perform. So welcome, Dieter. It's a pleasure to have you on. So we would love to jump into this conversation and tell us a little bit more about org design and potentially also your background and how you started to get fascinated by org design.
No, perfect. Thanks so much, Arun, and thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be on HR Unscripted. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of my background and why I then kind of jumped headfirst into organizational design. So I've always been fascinated by human behavior and to look at human behavior in an organizational setting. I started my career out in organizational development and talent and performance. And then from there, naturally, kind of I asked this question, but are we not fundamentally designing organizational systems incorrectly in organizations in such a way that all these things have a downstream impact and implication? And that kind of led me towards the org design field. And maybe a good point to start is, but what is org design? Because I think the term also gets thrown about, quite a bit. And the easiest way for me to explain it is to think about a metaphor. So if we are all builders and we are building a house, organizational design is the process that we would go through to identify the logic of how the rooms need to fit with one another, where we want to put the plumbing, where we want to lay the cables for the electricity, and then how do we connect towards the infrastructure that already exists on the street, right? So org design is about identifying the right blueprint, making informed decisions, and it usually happens as part of a structured process over time. And then we deep dive into the logic of the business, how the work is going to flow, what accountabilities look like, and most importantly, who makes what decisions where, to make sure that as an organization we are set up in order to be able to execute our strategy. So maybe that's a good starting point for us to kickstart, just with that definition of what is org design when we actually refer to it.
That's perfect. So thank you for explaining that and taking us through the overarching reason and the definitions. Now, in your experience so far, what would you say are the best cases for org design, and what are some of the? I'm sure you've seen tons of poor org designs. We don't have to name anyone, but I would love to hear some examples of on both sides and what you really liked about them.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question you ask around what are some of the best cases, right? And maybe it's easier to think there about what companies do well that really flourish in the org design space. And I think there's a couple of things. The one is they definitely look at org design as something that is continuously happening within the business and in the organization, and they make this differentiation between operating model changes, which is like a fundamentally big thing that we should not do too often because it changes our core of how we work, versus being adaptable and a lot more flexible within their structures and processes and workflows to be a lot more responsive towards the market. So companies that do that really well, I think the first misconception is that small companies do it well and big companies don't. I actually found it slightly the other way around. I think smaller organizations very often assume that everybody knows what to do, so they don't spend enough time on thinking about their org design right from the startup, scale up, right, kind of the spaces through there. And there's a lot of really good examples of scale-up companies, particularly that invested in org design very early on in their process to say, but this is actually the way that we want to grow, aligned to a set blueprint as opposed to just chasing some of those different opportunities. And then on the other side, I think there's also been really, really good large organizations where there's a lot of complexity, where they've realized that org design is actually the process that helps us simplify how work is going to happen. And without that blueprint, people tended to then start veering off course around what is going to be focus and priority and how things are going to happen. So in short, to answer your question, I think large organizations that keep it top of mind, that
Mm.
know where it fits, and that don't see it as this set event that only happens in response to something else. And I think that's the biggest mistake I see.
Right.
We need to cut costs. Let's do org design. Oh, we need to go into a new market. Let's do org design. Oh, we're buying a new business. Let's do org design. But actually see it as the continuous process. And
Yeah.
then on the other side, people that invest in it early and destigmatize it. So it doesn't become this thing that everybody fears to do. It
Yeah.
becomes a way that we talk about work. I think that's been some of the things I've observed, at least with various clients globally.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And so some of the examples I've seen as the motivations for change or design change has been when a leader leaves, right?
Yeah.
Or there's a change in leadership, and then suddenly the new leader wants to make a stamp or an impact in the company, and you see automatic, like whole scale org changes. So that's a really good example. So when I think what I really loved about what you said there is also distinguishing between the operating model
Mm.
and the org design. Um, so can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, so it's I almost assumed naively that they're very intertwined, right? So if an org design changes, then the operating model has to change. But I think that's a really good point that it doesn't necessarily have to.
Mm.
Um, what are some examples or some best practices or guiding principles when someone needs to think about that, right? So you have to change the org design, but you can still maintain. How would you go about
Yeah.
processing that?
No, and I think it's important to see org design as a process over time, but then
Mm,
fundamentally it asks 5 questions, which gets to the point around what's operating model versus what is just actual work structure. You
mm,
always start with a question around what is the game that we want to play. So that is strategic intent. Why are we here? What are we actually trying to drive?
yeah.
I do want to make the point that strategy and org design definitely need to be coupled quite closely together. They are definitely different, but they are very much interrelated.
Mm,
The second question, which is the one that we don't often spend enough time on, is what are the rules of the game? What are the design principles that we don't want to break, regardless of whatever we put in place? Now, those things tend to guide, and I'll give you a practical example. It would say something like, we would prioritize customer satisfaction over efficiency. Doesn't mean efficiency is not important, but it means when faced with a really difficult decision, customer satisfaction is going to be the priority.
right.
Third, you then want to ask, what do we need to be good at, which is capabilities, right? 3 to 5, it's my favorite question to ask any executive team because they want to be fantastic at everything.
Mm,
Realistically, you can't. So I ask the question, what's going to make you famous? Those 3 or 4 things that should be your non negotiables that you always want to invest in and to get right.
you're
Then
right.
you ask, how do we set up? And that's our blueprint. That's operating model. So that's the broader logic of how all these big different capability pieces sit together. And
Mm,
then the last question for me there is then you ask, how do we then practically play the game? So how do we execute the work, which is then structure? Structures can change over time because that is very, very dependent on circumstance and context and the talent you have available and what is priority now. But if you change the fundamental logic of your operating model, that is kind of going quite deep seated into the DNA of the organization. And that takes quite a long time to bring people along that process. There's a
right.
rule of thumb, not based on research, but kind of based on experience, that says if you're not going to get 30% more gains out of an operating model change, you have to ask the question, is it actually worth all the energy that we are going to spend to go down that route?
Yeah.
Structure change should be able to do that pretty quickly. That's literally sometimes reporting lines or geographies or locations. Those things,
Right.
I think, changes much more easily.
This is so powerful. I think I love the pyramid structure, right? So at the top of the pyramid almost is the strategic intent, and then it flows down from there, right? So design principles, capabilities, blueprint, and the executive structure. I have seen examples where the last rung tends to completely revamp the strategy,
Yep.
and that should not happen. You're 100% right. But I think in some of the situations when you have a change in leadership at the very, let's say, C-suite level, then you can start to see um, the full hierarchy changing.
Mm.
So in those kind of situations where there is a change at the top, when you have the CEOs or CTOs coming in, what should they? And I think the 30% rule is a very good rule of thumb, right?
Mm.
Is that going to give you what should they be taking into account to minimize damage to the organization by making huge changes?
I wish there was a rule we could implement that whenever a new leader comes in, they're not allowed to do anything for the first 2 months besides listen and understand what's happened up to now.
I like
Because I
that.
think a big mistake that a lot of these leaders make is they come in and then they want to really push their own agenda and the stamp that they want to put on what they're doing pretty quickly. And then
Mm.
very often they end up untangling certain things that might be working or might be in progress, because certain things in organizations take time. So my advice to any new leader would be is take a moment once you enter into the organization, go and understand firstly the history of what has led us towards this point. Whether you agree with the history or not doesn't matter. History is history and it's existing in the organizational system. Secondly, go and do a proper as is view of both the strategy and the org design, as well as then the talent that you have available within the organization. And then only start having these conversations about the 5 questions that I've mentioned pertaining to strategy and org design and how you want to take it forward. And I
Yeah.
mention that because I think leaders will be a lot more impactful if every single executive leader, and I know it's human nature, and I think I've probably also done it in the past. You come in and you want to change things, and there's a lot of new energy in the system, but very often it's a lot more valuable for the longer term just to understand what are already there and what are the parts that you can utilize in a bit of a different way.
Yeah.
You are absolutely correct. Very often that bottom tier drives the whole conversation to start kickstarting.
Yeah.
Best practice is to kind of link it more to a practice and a process. So, if we have an annual strategy review, it should feed into a bit of an org design review at a high level. And then
Yeah.
over a period of time, you go slightly deeper. But if it's these trigger events that something happened that is outside of the norm, I do want to encourage people to first just take a moment, take a breath, and ask the question, why are we doing this? And if so, what is then the best way to approach it, as opposed to bringing in a lot of ambiguity into the system. When you
Mm.
say org design, mostly people think restructure, cost cutting. They think their role is going to change, and they think, oh, here we go again. We've just decentralized. Now we're probably going to centralize again, and I'm
Yeah.
going to back to the original team that I was in.
Yeah.
That's the type of things that we should not allow to happen. But it does require responsible leadership that approaches these things in a slightly different way.
Mm.
And Dieter, you were talking about talent as well, and because we have quite a few people involved in HR listening to us, what do you think is the place of a CHRO or HR leader in org design, right? Because these initiatives can come from CXO or let's say
Yeah.
CEO in general. What would you say the place of HR is in org design?
Yeah, so I'm obviously biased, Alexis, on that one, coming from an HR background, but I firmly believe that the CHRO plays a critical role as a custodian of good organizational design practice. So I think the org design practice actually has a very strong home in the HR domain, whether that sits in org effectiveness or it stands as a standalone as part of the strategic side of HR. And then I think the CHRO role in itself is a key player around the custodian of responsible practice when we start playing these things out, because there will be the strategy connection that the CHRO also has to make to say, we're sitting around the boardroom and the things that I'm hearing is actually an org design conversation, but we haven't phrased it as such. Hang on, there's a different way that we can think about it, in that regard. What I found useful there is also to think about a bit of a triangle there. So if you think about a triangle, and org design sits smack bang in the middle of the triangle, business strategy is the top part of the triangle, and the bottom 2 legs is talent and performance.
Yeah.
Now, talent and
I like that one.
performance are HR related practices and processes,
Yeah.
and you have to keep that triangle in balance. And those 4 different concepts need to speak to each other. Otherwise, we start getting to the point where people don't know why we measure certain things, or people focus on things that's not driving strategy. And that's kind of, I think, the CHRO plays that role of maintaining the harmony between those different areas, for lack of a better word.
That's awesome. We have so many visuals coming out of this. I want to make
I
them.
warned you that my head thinks in pictures. So
I love that. No, this is perfect. I love the triangle. I love the pyramid. It's awesome. So speaking of the triangle and the bottom 2 sections, so the performance and the talent. So we're evolving as a like working practice within, at least in the Western world, with the remote working, or I dare say, like, we're also potentially getting into this area of more contract style working. So day rate based work or freelance work. So in that kind of a situation, so there are two areas. So one is this kind of like an evolving practice of work, and then the other part is, as a result, more globally diverse workforce, right? So people are just moving to places with this visas. So in that kind of a climate, how do you think about like org design, and is that something that you take into account as an evolving landscape? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the first discussion should always first be around what is the work that has to get done. Because I think very often we start the org design conversation thinking about the people. And I know it might sound strange for some listeners, coming from somebody that comes from the HR domain, to say, before we talk people, let's first talk work and what the work is that needs to happen. And then I think the conversation becomes a little bit more intricate there around what are the different ways that we think about getting that work done, and then different talent strategies start playing a role. And there, I think there's sometimes other factors around skill availability in certain markets. I think there's definitely, preferences around how people want to work and where organizations are located and how they manage that employer-employee relationship, as well as then, we do see, Arun, to your point, a lot of, can I call them, just for our conversation, non-traditional talent pools coming into the mix that look at different work arrangements and different work contracts. I think the more complex the talent landscape becomes, the more stronger attention needs to be focused on the org design piece, because the better you understand the work that needs to get done, the better you can explore different and various strategies. A mistake that a lot of organizations have made in the past is that they think org design is about the permanent organization. It's not. Org design is about the work that needs to happen. The organization is the vehicle and the mechanism to deliver it. And then we start talking about how are we going to supply the right talent with the right skills to be able to execute. So, I get this question a lot, especially organizations that work according to agile methodologies, and they say, oh, org design is too hierarchical, it keeps us back, it is too slow. I will challenge you on that by saying that I think the more agile and flexible you want to be, the stronger your core principles around your org design needs to be, because org design creates clarity. And that's the biggest thing when you want to adopt non-traditional models, that you need to be able to create literally almost on a daily basis, around clarity of work, clarity of decision making. When you start getting into remote environments, just wearing my talent management hat for a moment, clarity is what you want to create regardless of somebody's paid via payroll or invoice line, or whether they're a freelancer. They want to understand, what is the work that I need to deliver, what is the expectation of me, and how are we going to do it. And fundamentally, those three things are org design questions before they become a people question. And I think that's quite an important balance to maintain.
I think you're 100% right. Clarity. A lot of companies sometimes go with the matrix structure, or what they think is a matrix structure. I feel like it's a hack, and it's not really a hack in terms of that fact that it works. It doesn't work. I think it just creates more confusion and chaos. So in terms of the org design principles, how do you see matrix structures? Are you a fan of them? Do you not like them at all? Or how does it? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think matrix structures do have their place. However, there's a couple of caveats to my comment there, right? So I think a matrix structure, if the fight there is around who holds the power pertaining to reporting line, then your matrix structure is doomed right from the get-go, right? So I sometimes sit in these conversations and people say, what's the dotted line versus what is the straight reporting line?
Right.
You've missed the boat there, because we are arguing about, who's got more people reporting directly into them.
Right.
I think if you take a step back and say, matrix structures work in environments where you do want things like global alignment, but you want local execution, for example, or you're in an environment where you have different product lines that need to be localized differently or deal with different legislation. In those, matrix structures do work, but matrix structures only work if there's very, very clear governance. And governance in this instance is not a bad word. It's just around our mechanisms of how we run it is pretty clear, and everybody is aligned to that. And to come back to some of our earlier points, you need quite a mature leadership team that is able to kind of remove ego out of the equation to work in a matrix structure, because it's not about me and my little kingdom, if I may be so blunt. It's a little bit more about how do we guide people with these conflicting priorities that they often find, because that's the biggest challenge with the matrix structure. Boss A says, I need to do this. Boss B says, this is priority. And I'm kind of caught in the middle. I actually don't know what I need to do. So I think if you can avoid a matrix structure for as long as possible, I would advise that. If it really becomes necessary because your organization is complex enough, put the things around it that's going to make it work, and have a very open conversation about power with your leadership team very early on in the process. people sometimes get shocked there a little bit when we do org design and they choose that as an option. And I said, okay, are you going to play with each other when we do implement the structure or not? And then they're like, but what do you mean? Of course we will. And then I say, these are the limitations of a matrix structure. Are you willing to deal with these limitations? And what happens if you don't? These are the symptoms that you will start seeing, and how are we going to spot them proactively?
I completely agree with that. And so I think one of the things I used to say was, if you have two people as owners or three people as owners of a thing, that means you have no owners for that thing. So I do think that matrix structure suffers from that. Like, all the leaders have this joint ownership of areas, but the reality is it doesn't really always play out that way.
But I've seen that a lot, right, as HR as well, you know, matrix structure. And I think the example you gave were really relevant. What would be the tips for success that you would give to the leadership or to people who are in a matrix structure? Maybe the dotted line and the straight line, and also the person who reports to those people. What would be the main tips you would give for you know, a successful implementation of a matrix structure such as this?
No, that's a great question. You know, the thing I would advise is have a very clear conversation to clarify mandate. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say it's a global versus a local structure, and I'm kind of sitting in between in a function. Clarify what is the mandate around what comes from global and what's the means that it comes down and what decisions gets made there, versus what is the decisions and the mandate that sits at a local level, so that we are very clear around who makes what type of decision and where to go for what type of guidance. The other thing for people also sitting in those structures, the mistake we often make is I go and manage up and I go manage sideways. Make those two also manage each other to have certain conversations and determine what certain priorities are going to be. So kick it one level up, because that relationship is a much more important one, if I may put it bluntly, than the one around the instruction on what we need to do. And then the last thing there, and I know, you know, performance is the practice everybody loves to hate, and we can deep dive into that, you know, for a very long period of time, but be very clear on expectation and outcome. And the moment that those things start becoming a lot more confused, raise that conversation immediately. In a matrix structure, don't let things fester, because these little things that nudge it away from what it is supposed to be. But have a conversation around mandate, role, and decision making. That's, I think, the three that helps a lot in a matrix structure, in a matrix environment.
Completely agree with that. Yeah, Alexei, did you have another?
Yeah, no. I just had just a follow up, and that's clearly. I mean, that was. I had a clear example of that where we had a CMO and a country head and a local marketing person, and we had to deal with that situation where the local marketing person had to report to the local managing director, but they had a dotted line to the CMO, and that's exactly what you described. And I think, you know, I would have loved to have this conversation before I had to manage this situation.
Maybe a comment on that, Alex, is a mistake we sometimes make is we assume that the budget is where the power lies, which is not necessarily always the case, right? You could potentially manage budgets locally because it makes a lot more sense to do so, but there are still decisions that happens at a different place, and the other way around. We sometimes assume that power hierarchy in an organization is a little bit, you know, out of kilter as well. So I think have the mandate conversation and then put the mechanisms in place around that. Don't immediately say, you know, whoever owns the P&L is the decision maker.
Exactly.
Complex organizations, that's not as clear cut as it might sound, you know, by just making the point. So I think it's worthwhile to have those discussions.
And that's a very good point.
That's a really good point. So the other question I have, I think in general, is like, especially in a large company. So I worked for Expedia at one point, and there were about 35,000 people at one point at Expedia. It was huge. So when you have that kind of an organization, a lot of the time at the C-suite, you're only hearing from your, you know, direct reports on how the organization is doing, and you think that you have the best strategy, very clearly defined strategy, everyone is following suit, but then on the grassroots level it could be chaos because you know, people are trying to work across time zones and it's not really working, the structure is falling apart. So for the business leaders at the top, so those companies also then end up doing surveys, right? So you try to get some idea of what's happening, and those surveys never really give you the real answer. They are very protected. So for business leaders like that, who are in big organizations, like, do you have any advice on how you can deduct that there is some org design that needs to be thought of, or that's something that needs to be considered?
Yeah, I think there's to your point on, the view from the top and the view from the bottom tends to be very different in most organizations, and I think that it is important that org design is a evidence-based and data-driven practice, but it has to contain both quantitative and qualitative data. Sometimes we err on the side of looking at quantitative data only, and then missing a lot of things that happens in organizations, even organizations that size and larger, around how work gets done, which sometimes is through networks, relationships, things that the formal organizational design does not necessarily tell you. So I think make sure that you are informed about what I call it the informal organization. So the real things, those people you need to know, the stuff you need to know how to be able to do to really be successful in the business.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, get the right voices in the room when you're having the org design conversation. It's not necessarily, some people have to be there because they are decision makers, but other people have to bring certain knowledge and insight to the table. And people sometimes smile at me when I make this comment, but there's, for me, four people that has to be in your room when you do org design, right? The one is people that know where we're going, which is usually a leadership team member, so vision, strategy, etc.
Yeah.
People that know where we are, people that know operations and product and services, so could typically have quite a strong view of that, around that. People that know where all the bodies are buried, so people that have experience within the organization and can tell you the stuff that's really happening below the surface. And then people that have not drunk the Kool-Aid of the organization yet, so people that have a fresh perspective, that's trying to do certain new things and that hasn't been part of kind of the organizational system for a period of time. Now, I know it sounds silly to categorize them as that, but if you start thinking about them in that way, as opposed to think about them aligned to a current organogram that you have and a leadership structure, you start getting various different views into the table, around the table. Now, there still has to be a decision maker which sits in the leadership side of things, but I think it's so valuable to hear some of these different views. And where we've run quite big org design projects, we would typically go through almost like a discovery phase where we get these people around the table and start analyzing data, hearing the stories from people, hearing and getting some feedback and exposing the smaller design team to that, so that when they do get around the table and have to make difficult calls on do we do A or B, they do that with a bit more context in the room as well. So if you're a leader, get out from behind your desk. Don't just read a report. Go and live in the business for a while and sense, what that needs to do. I'll use one practical example before I throw it back to you. We did an org design for a very big global media provider. And the one thing we did for the core team that had to be part of the org design was they had to go and job shadow the media team that was literally at the sports stadiums rigging cameras. They had to sit in the van with the team for a period of time when they were producing a football match, for example.
That's
Based
awesome.
on that, when we started having org design conversations, it changed from theoretically we think this is important to, that time when I sat in the van, I saw this is not going to work, right? That doesn't work in the real world. Can we not do something slightly differently? So get context. That's the big thing leaders need to get right.
I think you're so right. Yeah, I think that's essential. We should probably have like some version of an undercover boss. But I think there is so much value there. I think, to your point, the having the strategist and the operations expert in the room, I think most leaders get that right.
Yeah.
And what they don't get right is the last two characters, right? So the person who didn't drink the Kool-Aid and the person who knows where the bodies are buried.
These are my favorite categories.
I think they're essential. And you're so right in that every organization, especially large organization, they have the formal organization and the informal organization. And so you do have so in a world where we're more getting remote work, there are fewer of the water cooler moments, and so there's like lesser of the, would you say that there's a lesser chance of having an informal organization, and in which case I see that as a big loss for everyone?
I actually think the informal organization becomes a lot stronger, because I think people find ways to still connect to colleagues and to work in various ways. Yes,
Yeah.
when it goes wrong, I think people have a chance of becoming a lot more isolated from the organization because the water cooler conversation does not happen. But we are social beings, so people find other ways of getting things done. So what's really interesting for me is to not look at only the formal processes we've put down for people to work. Look at what happens in between those different elements, right? I'm a very big fan of, doing things like network analysis to see, who's communicating with who, just so that you have an understanding of how the organization flows.
Yeah.
But you have to create an environment for people to feel comfortable doing that. If you have a culture of fear or mistrust, informal organizations then tend to whittle out, whether they are remote or in person. So, I think that's an important thing to just bear in mind if you're a leader.
That's awesome. I just glanced at the time, and we are at time. And like I said earlier, I would love to keep talking about this. This is like, we could have another conversation. We would love to have you back for sure at some point if you're available.
Yeah, would love to do that.
Yeah, and I think maybe we can talk about more similar things, or we can talk about something else. But again, thank you so much for your time, Dieter. We really appreciate you having, making the time for us and coming and joining us. We've had so much wealth of knowledge drops in here. So we're going to make snippets of this recording session and share it. So anyone who missed it, but hopefully that's going to be very valuable for everyone. But thanks again.
It is.
Really.
Thank you so much, Dieter. It was a pleasure having you.
No, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, look forward to the next one.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Dieter. Thanks, everyone. See you guys later.
See you.